Well, let's get started with chapter 4. And this one is, this chapter kind of starts too early and kind of ends too late, in my opinion. It's referred to as westward expansion and reservations. I could fit probably 3 chapters within the temporal parameters of what this is supposed to cover, and it doesn't cover it really well. We're going to do our best. Here are some terms to get started. Some of these are going to be reviewed, but accession refers basically, in terms of a legal sense, it's going to refer to land that has been ceded or turned over to the United States. And in so doing, when the United States takes possession of it, the Indian title is considered to be extinguished. We got that confirmed with Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, right? So the finding of Johnson versus, the most important finding of Johnson versus McIntosh was that Indian tribes and individual Indian people cannot convey, that is, sell or trade or exchange or give land of any kind that has Indian title to non-Indians. Okay, so you can't, a tribal member cannot sell land to a non-Indian or to another Indian of a different tribe, for that matter. I guess I never thought about that, but that would be true too. Okay, so a reserve. The term reserve kind of predates Indian policy, but in a very generic sense, the term reserve relative to the federal government refers to any land that's in the public domain, so-called federal land, that has been designated and therefore reserved from alienation for a particular purpose. The public domain, as you might recall, was created for a reason, or at least what we would call the federal public domain. That was taken from the states, or received from the states, the sovereign states, with the idea that it would be sold to individual settlers, and then the revenue produced would help pay off the war debts of the states. And you would think that would be pretty easy to do. It was also supposed, land sales, that is, sales of the public domain, were intended to run the federal government from the very beginning. They didn't realize that the federal government was going to explode in size after about 1860, and then again after about 1932, and then in the 60s. So anyway, the federal government intended to alienate this land to American settlers. Okay, but in time there became movements to keep some of that public domain out of the hands of private individuals. I suppose that Indian reservations are the very first example. I think that's probably accurate to say. Following, however, closely that idea of reserving lands, beginning about the 1860s, 1870s for sure, certain lands were taken out of the public domain, particularly in the West. Public lands were taken out of the public domain and reserved to keep for some reason or another. Generally, it was for a purpose to keep the private sector from developing the land. And really the very first example is 1872 with the creation of Yellowstone National Park. In 1872, the federal government did something strange. It decided to cordon off an area of the public domain in the far west, the Mountain West, and retain this special area for wilderness, or at least to keep it in a state of natural conditions for the pleasure of the people of the United States. And that would later develop, mostly in the 1890s and afterward, into the movement to create national parks. And even before that, a movement to create national forests and even national grasslands. So some of the public domain began to be cordoned off by the federal government and removed from alienation, removed from having the possibility of alienation, similar to Indian reservations and later allotments. Okay, so those were considered held by the federal government for the exclusive use of parks or for forest resource management or for the use of an Indian tribe. Okay. All right. Now, let's look at, there are really kind of three different types of Indian country, just to make sure, by about 1880. So I just chose 1880 because that's right in the middle of the period of establishing reservations around the country. Okay, there certainly were reservations established earlier than that, as you know, 50 years earlier than that at least. And there would continue to be reservations created after 1880. And in the 1930s, even land was added to certain Indian reservations. So 1880 is just kind of in the middle of this. And at that time, there were really just three kinds of land, three kinds of Indian country, and that would be, there was very little of this left, unceded Aboriginal title land that was occupied by tribes but not recognized. Do you remember what year we bought Alaska from Russia? Well, it was right before this, in the 1870s. 1876, I want to say. 1867 maybe. Anyway. But Alaska became a United States protectorate, eventually a United States territory. Didn't become a state until almost 1960. And Alaska had never had any sort of recognition of Native people. So there had never been an Indian treaty signed in Alaska. There had never been really formal recognition of tribes because there had never been much interest in taking land by the federal government. So there was unceded Indian land after 1880, and that was mostly in Alaska. Number two, unceded Indian land in Aboriginal title recognized by the federal government, which is very different. In this case, we're talking about Indian reservations that included land that was part of the Aboriginal land base. Navajo Nation, for example. Great Sioux Reservation, for example. So, and of course in Oklahoma, we kind of, Oklahoma's kind of exceptional in the sense that most of the tribes, vast majority of the 39 recognized tribes, are people who were brought to Oklahoma from somewhere else. Often the reservations that were established here were created or designated for different tribes who were leaving existing reservations already. Some tribes had moved 2 and 3 times already. So anyway, keep in mind that there is this unceded Aboriginal land that is recognized as reservations. And then, of course, there's formerly ceded land held in trust for the exclusive use of an Indian tribe. Much of Oklahoma was in that category. The Wichita and the Caddo generally are considered, maybe the Osage also are considered, Aboriginal to Oklahoma or indigenous to Oklahoma, this area, and the Comanche also. So, there are some sort of caveats to that. All right, we've talked about the Indian Office being established in 1824 within the Department of War. The Department of War would later sort of emerge into the Department of State and, of course, the Department of Defense. The main reason it was placed into the Department of War, as I've said, is because Indian tribes were considered sovereign. They were considered analogous to working with foreign countries. So the sovereignty is recognized. Your textbook makes a big deal, your textbook author makes a big deal out of the idea of the Indian Office being moved to the Department of the Interior. As if Native peoples were suddenly, well, they're no longer a threat, therefore we'll just put them back on the back burner and, deal with them like the Geological Survey or something like that, like they're part of the land. Maybe, but really the truth is, in 1849, the federal government reorganized all of the cabinets, and they created something called the Department of the Interior. And the Department of the Interior had pretty much the sole authority to administer federal lands. Okay? Federal lands. That included things like the public domain. The existing public domain in 1849 included most of the Great Plains, which would later be taken up by the Homestead Act in the 1860s. But those public lands were alienated to individual settlers through the General Land Office, which was part of the Department of the Interior. Other parts of the Department of the Interior would later be created, like the National Park Service, to deal with parks. Later on, the Bureau of Land Management would be created much later. Before that, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Grazing Service. All of these agencies had some sort of authority over federal lands within the United States. Indian reservations were also considered federal lands, therefore they were placed within the Department of the Interior. It was not an intentional insult. It was just logical. The Indian Service is what became, it was often the people who worked in the Indian Office, and they didn't call it the Bureau of Indian Affairs until the 20th century, but the Indian Office, or the Office of Indian Affairs, people who worked within that service or within that agency were referred to work within the Indian Service, kind of like the military service or something, but or the Forest Service. Okay, so Indian Service is where that comes from. The Bureau of Indian Affairs would be that term would come after 1934, after the Indian Reorganization Act and the New Deal. Okay, now let's talk about treaties, because this is the era of expansion and treaties. And like I said, if I could change the organization of the textbook, I would add probably a chapter on treaties and the whole treaty process. But we'll work with what we got here. Indian treaties did very similar things. If you go to the OSU Library's website, which is essentially a set of scanned pages in PDF, or actually they're in JPEGs. I don't know why they don't put them in PDFs, but what they have done is they've scanned a several volume set of books by a fellow by the name of Kapler, who compiled all of the treaties and other formal agreements between the Congress or United States and Indian tribes, compiled all that around the turn of around the year 1903, I think, 1908, something like that. So if you've ever seen the hard copy set, which I have, it stacks up to about this high. And so what the library's done is they've scanned all these, and they've created a way that you can search them and find them real quickly online. And that service is actually considered very valuable across the disciplines that study U.S. Indian policy and Indian law. But if you look at those treaties, and I invite you to do that, the treaties begin to seem pretty similar. They have similar sections, they have the same sort of formality, they use the same terminology. With some differences, but here are some typical things that you will see in an Indian treaty, particularly one of the earlier Indian treaties, okay? Number one, there's a recognition, sort of a legal formality, there is a recognition of the rights of the negotiators representing the United States and representing one or more Indian tribes to engage in some sort of negotiation, okay? So first of all, we're saying we're legitimate, okay? And number two, typically what you'll find is a statement about how the tribes recognize the United States sovereignty. And also recognize, sometimes they say recognize dependence on the United States, okay, after 1823. So they'll recognize the sovereignty of the United States and will say that they attempt to maintain good relations and peace with the United States. Then you'll see things like, before anything else happens, any captives among the tribe will be returned, or perhaps any indemnities against the tribe will be paid for because of what they used to call spoliations against the Indian tribes by non-Indians, by settlers. So anyway, it's sort of an attempt to kind of clean things up before the business at hand. Then one of the very most important parts is a long, very carefully detailed description of boundaries associated with the land. And these boundaries are identified, and the boundaries are then brought into the business of the treaty, and that is to divide that land, or to create a new boundary on that land, or completely to cede the entire parcel. And this is usually the bulk of the treaty. So a treaty of cession, and most treaties are treaties of cession, if not just treaties of peace, most of them are cessions. There is land that's ceded to the United States in return for some sort of payment that is an actual, one-time payment for that in some way, plus other sorts of compensation. Okay, and this varies. Usually, however, there's going to be something referred to as annuities. That is, the United States promises in the treaty to supply a certain amount of merchandise or cattle or mostly dry goods and that sort of thing to the Indian tribe each year. So there is an annual expectation of receiving this payment of, you want to call it payment or compensation for the cession. Sometimes the treaties create annuities that are identified as annuities in perpetuity. Okay? Annuities in perpetuity. In other words, annuities, or the equivalent of forever. All right? Then, the cession itself, the land that is ceded by the tribe, is recognized as, once the treaty is signed, the title will be changed from an Indian title to United States holdings, public lands. So this means this is the point to where in the treaty where the Indian title to the land is extinguished. The resulting, or the remnant lands, or maybe perhaps another parcel of land somewhere else, is then recognized as a reservation, as recognized for the exclusive use of the Indian tribe. And then sometimes there are terms required for the reservation to remain a reservation. And what I mean by that is you will see after about 1840, 1850, you will see inklings of a statement like this. In the future, whensoever the tribe decides that it would like to take individual parcels from this reservation, all they need to do is let the agent know, or let the Department of the Interior know, or let the Secretary of the Interior know. And the United States will do its very best to divide the reservation up into individual parcels. Okay? In other words, allotment, which we'll often say began in 1887 in earnest, allotment had been around a lot longer. The idea of allotment had been around a lot longer than 1887, or at least 1883, or whenever the Dawes Commission got moving. So the whole idea of Indian reservations, often from the very earliest years, Indian reservations were created, and then the federal government slipped in a little clause that said, whenever you want to, we'll be happy to show up and survey the reservation for you and divide it up into allotments so that you can become individual landowners and assimilate it into the United States population, economically and socially and culturally.
Sometimes, like in a case of like the Chickasaws, like
Pardon?
forced allotments. Like,
Yeah, we'll get into the forced allotment. The 5 civilized tribes fought allotment hard. Yeah, the Creek Nation particularly was, they were organized in resisting allotment, but that didn't matter to the federal government.
Land too. I've heard a lot of stories that like some of the worst land was given to the 5 civilized tribes. Is what I've heard. I mean, some
Well, the worst lands were given to the people who refused to take allotments, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because in the 5 tribes allotment agreements, the problem was they had to get names on a roll. So if you were recognized as a tribal member, once you got your name on the roll, then you could select your allotment. And in fact, in most cases, to select your allotments, because they received a homestead allotment and a surplus allotment. But the thing about that, of course, was there were a lot of non-Indians who got on the rolls, right? And a lot of people who said, yeah, sure, I'll take my allotment, okay? And they took the best land first. So the best land went first. The people who resisted got the worst land. Anyway, we'll get into that after the first exam, actually. We'll get into that later, before the first exam. Okay. So then we have, after all of those terms, the mentioning of allotment and that sort of thing, you'll have the signatures of the negotiators. Here they are for the United States. Typically, they were people who worked for the Indian Service. They were typically Indian agents who were in the field, who lived among the tribes. Sometimes, early on, they were traders who were respected among the tribe, who were sort of worked as intermediaries between the government and the tribe. And then, of course, the leading people of the tribe, I don't want to say chiefs, but that's usually the way they were referred, or they're usually called the headmen, or the kings. Early on, they were called the kings in the colonial times. But typically, it was a number of individuals, not just one person, but a number of individuals. Now, as I mentioned last time, with removal treaties, for example, every one of those removal treaties of the 5 tribes split the tribe politically between people who wanted to settle with the government and get this problem over with and move west, which are usually minority, and typically the wealthy minority, the acculturated wealthy minority. And then typically the majority who resisted that whole thing, didn't want to leave their lands, didn't want to leave their farms, didn't want to go into the west where they, they often said the wild Indians live, the Comanches and, the Plains tribes. They didn't want to go out there. So they found themselves to be referred to as the traditionalists often. The people who signed the treaties, the group and I'm most familiar with the Cherokee Nation, the treaty party in the Cherokee Nation were made up of the Ridge family, John Ridge and the Ridge, the elder patriarch of the family, cousin of Stan Wadey. Anyway, those folks, they were slave-holding plantation owners, and they wanted to move west because going west was kind of an opportunity for them in a lot of ways. They realized that if they went west, they'd have pretty much all the land they ever wanted. They wouldn't be bothered by whites. In fact, they would be able to kind of establish themselves in a way that maybe they weren't able to in the East. So keep in mind that stay away from those monolithic narratives where the poor tribe was taken here forcibly there. Well, no, not necessarily. It was split. Some people, minority, found opportunities and kind of screwed their whole tribe politically.
Those are usually read a book about that, and they're usually they own plantations and they're very wealthy. Yeah, so they saw benefit for themselves. And they secretly signed is what I.
Oh yeah. And the Cherokee Treaty was signed at night during a thunderstorm or a snowstorm, in secret. And I think it was Colonel Ridge, is that his name? Major Ridge. When Major Ridge, or maybe it was John Ridge, his son, signed the treaty, they said, and the Cherokee Nation had already passed a law that said anybody who cedes land, assigns, who treats with the United States government and cedes land, that's a death sentence, okay? You will be killed. And when he signed it, he supposedly said, this is what the U.S. negotiators said, I just signed my death warrant. They moved to Indian Territory. They moved to Cherokee Nation. Within a year, all three of those guys who signed that treaty were murdered. In fact, I think two of them were murdered at the same time. It was a very organized assassination. That all three of them were assassinated. So, and when in 1839, when the rest of the tribe, or when the number of people who actually made it to Indian Territory arrived, by 1840, there was a civil war among the Cherokees beginning between those two groups. Those two groups would also fight during the Civil War. One of them would side with the Confederacy, and the rest of them would side with the Union. So it was political rift.
How was it that there's the Eastern Band of Cherokee? How was it they were able to stay there?
The Eastern Band, I mentioned them last time, I think. The Eastern Band they're the descendants of a very small remnant who hid out in extreme western North Carolina. And so now you have this reservation. It's called the Cherokee Reservation. It's also referred to as the Qualla Boundary. It's an actual reservation, but it was pretty much just one town of Cherokees. So the Cherokee Nation, like Creeks, they refer to their settlement areas as towns, even though it has nothing to do with like a central business district and all that. It's basically a rural area where a lot of farms are scattered, typically along a river valley where there's farmland. So they referred to different towns, and the Cherokees had about 5 or 6 different towns originally. but this was the one town, and they were the most isolated sort of most mountainous of the Cherokees. They speak a different dialect to this day, yeah, and probably a lot of that is, I mean, supposedly their dialect was different. Anyway.
It wasn't that long ago because I have a friend that speaks Cherokee and he told me that he can't hardly talk to them.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, it wasn't that long.
Well, the syllabary was created here in Indian Territory. So, well, no, that's not right. That's not right. Take that back. Sorry. The syllabary was created in Georgia, and I suppose, I don't know, maybe they did read, Cherokee, but the dialect, the dialects were supposedly different originally, but of course we've had divergence, geographical divergence. Okay, we're getting off topic. It is an interesting topic, though. Okay, so just remember, George Guest, Sequoyah, did come up with the syllabary. Actually, he lived in Tennessee. He lived in Tennessee, not what was Tennessee. Okay. What were reservations supposed to do? Well, they reflected what Chief Justice John Marshall identified as the inherent right to possess the land. Or actually, the way he defined Indian title, and we haven't really talked in depth about this, but if you read this chapter, which talks about he covers the other two cases of the Marshall Trilogy, which are Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which was thrown out of court, never heard, was rejected by the Supreme Court as not within their jurisdiction, and Worcester versus Georgia, which basically separated state authority from tribal authority or from tribal land. You'll read more about those. But the idea of Indian title as defined by John Marshall pretty much is that Indian title is a right to possession. Okay? It's a possessory right. Indian tribes have the inherent right to possess their land and to use their land as they wish. This would later become important in defining things like land use and defining reservations. But that right to possess the land is part of sovereignty and part of the Indian title, the right of possession, not of sale, but of possession. So initially, the reservation and this would have to be sort of parsed out by the courts in the 20th century, even. We'll see it when we get to water rights. Very interesting. The reservations were found by the courts to be the place where the tribe was assumed to reside into the future. So the reservation was created for the exclusive use of an Indian tribe, for them to possess, for them to use, and for them to use to support themselves. I said their selves, that's an Oklahomaism. Okay? His self, their self. So they could possess it without being interfered with from outside, to live their own, to live their life for generation after generation. So the reservation is assumed to be the land base for the tribe in perpetuity, to support that sovereign nation for the rest of eternity. And I mentioned the the prohibition against disposing of the land. So at any time, the tribe could decide they wanted to have the reservation allotted, or they could just tell the United States that they didn't want to be recognized as tribes anymore and just take the reservation. But of course, that never happened. So Indian title in perpetuity, forever. Reservations are intended for the tribe's subsistence, and there's an assumption that subsistence would be by way of agriculture. Okay? The courts would later find that, well, the whole implication of a reservation was to get Native peoples to stay in one place and to settle down. Not that all tribes were, somewhat nomadic. That's a bad term, nomadic. No tribe was nomadic, like wandering, like a freshman on campus wandering around, dazed. Okay, tribes systematically used some tribes, like the Plains tribes and the Mountain West tribes, it used different areas at different times of the year because they exploited natural resources at those different times of the year. So they had to move around. Carrying capacity wasn't very good to stay in one place. In fact, you'd be a fool to stay in one place. So they moved around, and of course, popular culture in the United States said, well, they were nomadic, like the Bedouin Arabs, the savage, or what do they call them, barbarians, Bedouins, and those folks, they wandered around aimlessly. That's not true. So the idea of creating a reservation was creating a land base on which agriculture would be the basis of subsistence for the tribe. Now this was all done, of course, way before the United States had entered an industrial revolution, and they certainly never assumed that Native peoples would ever want to do anything other than farm. Okay, boy, were they wrong. But the idea of agriculture would be very, very, very important in securing certain, and I don't want to say rights because it's using the term right, like this is my civil right. I try my very best to avoid saying that because Indians aren't given rights. Indian tribes have inherent rights, just as supposedly American citizens have inherent rights. The United States Constitution doesn't give us rights, does it? It only protects us from the federal government infringing on those rights that already exist. So, what I try to say is that things like water rights, the tribe has always had the possession of the water, right? They never gave it up. And they certainly didn't receive the right to use it from the federal government. What they did was they reserved the use of the resource, or they reserved something when they ceded the land. When they ceded some land to the United States, they didn't necessarily cede their rights to hunt on that land or to fish somewhere within that land, the rivers. Very, very important. So tribes don't ever receive, they only give. In the history of the United States, tribes don't receive from the United States. Tribes give to the United States, but they don't give everything. The treaties are important because they often demonstrate what the tribe actually did not lose, what they did not give up. If it's not mentioned in the treaty, they didn't give it up. Therefore, it's still there. So it's kind of a, sort of a negative results thing. As they say in graduate school when you're writing your dissertation, don't worry if your experiment doesn't work. Negative results are just as important as positive results, okay? So don't worry about failing. That's, you're still finding that it doesn't work. That's important. Not very encouraging, but it's okay supposedly. Okay, so at 1849, this is the year, remember, that the Department of the Interior is created, and your textbook author provides the first real address by the United States Commissioner of Indian Affairs under the new Department of the Interior. And in that statement, you'll notice 1849 that here's the policy that we're engaged in, and that's establishing reservations for the native peoples. We seek, peace among the Indians and between the Indians and the non-Indians. And then you begin to see what the social scientists point to as sort of the beginnings of the paternalistic, really the formal paternalism of the Indian policy, the federal Indian policy. Before like the War of 1812, it was still considered a likelihood that the United States might be overthrown, might be retaken by the mother country, and that they would have a lot of willing allies in native peoples, right? And then, after about 1815, the United States and Europe, well, really the United States especially, embarked on what is often referred to as the age, or the era of good feelings. You ever heard of that? Era of good feelings. And it's sort of a lull in European warfare, because the Europeans have been killing themselves for millennia. It's sort of a lull, and it's after the Napoleonic Wars, and there's a little bit of peace. The British Navy winds up colonizing most of the world, or at least the British and the French especially start colonizing the world where they haven't been. The United States colonizes its territory by moving west, right? So some people call it internal colonization. It's just called imperial expansionism. And a lot of people get squeamish when you use the word imperialism about the United States, because we broke away from an imperial power. Well, we broke away from imperial power so we could do it ourselves, right? We didn't want anybody else telling us how to do it. The United States broke away specifically so they wouldn't have to take things like, British Indian policy from them, from a foreign power. So they could represent themselves as they expanded their own empire. Anyway, I'm not anti-American. I'm just saying what I saw, okay? All right, so, but this period brings about this sort of paternalistic, this is when the United States is, really becoming, historians might describe the American people at this time as very confident in their abilities and their culture. And of course, it has a lot to do with economic boom, success, and natural resources that seem to be endless in the 19th century. It's also a period, 1849. 1849 is kind of at the end of the Second Great Awakening, when Christianity kind of teamed up with expansionism. Christianity kind of teamed up with this idea of moving west, and that we have this dream of manifest destiny, sort of a quasi-religious belief that the United States would simply take the continent, or at least we should have a country from sea to shining sea. Christianity, capitalism, sobriety, that was a virtue apparently at one time. So these things were considered to be things that needed to be taught to native peoples, to incorporate them into American society. Anybody ever see one of my favorite movies? It's probably my favorite. It's not the greatest acting in the world, but a Dustin Hoffman movie called Little Big Man, made in 1971. Okay, you know the scene when the good preacher and his wife take in Jack, You know, so this is what I always think about. You know, this is that was a pretty good portrayal of, you know, we're gonna beat you into submission. We're gonna, here he is, a Jewish guy from New York playing a Cheyenne, playing an Anglo-American who was captured by Cheyenne, raised as a Native American, and then in this first battle against the whites, he chickens out, and says, "Hey, wait, I'm white, don't kill me," you know. So then they turn him over to. It's like he was a captive, you know. He was a captive that was raised among the wild Indians, and so they take him back and hand him over to this disgusting preacher who seems to want to eat fried chicken all day, and his wife, who is not real interested in him. But anyway, it's a funny story. It's a funny movie in some ways. In other ways, it's very sad. Yeah, it's sad and funny at the same time. Yeah. So, but anyway, you know, sobriety, Christianity, capitalism, all this stuff. You know, we should change these people to make them better, make them like us. All right. So, and the great thing about that movie, of course, is that it's all a sham anyway, right? But yet we're forcing it on other people. It's like nobody lives up to these standards anyway, but we're going to try to force it on somebody else. Yeah. All right. So at this time, or in that letter, you also notice that the Plains tribes seem to be the focus. 1849, of course, this is the period when the frontier of settlement, if you want to call it that, is about to cross what was often referred to as the permanent Indian frontier. At least in 1824, they call it the permanent Indian frontier, which would include most of the eastern boundary of the state of Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska. So settlement was pushing into Nebraska and Kansas at that time. And the idea was that, okay, the native peoples are out there, we want to put them on reservations, but it's going to be hard to do that, and more than likely, you notice that the extermination of the bison, which wouldn't come until the 1870s, is mentioned in 1849 in that letter. Did you catch that? They mentioned, if we have to, we're going to have to kill off all the bison because that's what they depend on, and that's what makes them free. That's what keeps them resistant and independent. So the United States is wanting to kill the independence of these people, All right. Oh, and one other thing that they did to impress upon the leadership, they would often, of course, bring, the headmen, the elders, or whomever the leadership was. They would often take them to Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. in the 1840s, 1850s was pretty impressive, even, by that time. It was created basically in 1800, and they built it like crazy. So to impress, and also just to take them to the eastern cities to see, urban life and how things were so different. To sell them on American culture, or at least to shock them into submission. There are a lot of other movies I could mention, but I'll do you the service of not doing that, okay? I love movie scenes that have some meaning sometimes. All right, so the Friends of the Indians. These are the people who actually called themselves the Friends of the Indians. This is before Facebook. Can you imagine this? Okay, so I have a lot of bad memories of Facebook, and I really don't like Facebook whatsoever. I don't have an account, but anybody who asks you to be their friend online, probably not your friend anyway, right? I mean, that is just odd. I just think that's weird. So, and then you can defriend somebody. So, right? So, anyway, so these are the New England Protestants. the people who had been Puritans several generations back were now Congregationalists, and other groups that had arisen during the Second Great Awakening in places like New York and Ohio and Kentucky, especially in those areas where there's a lot of experimentation going on with religion. And, why is there a lot of experimentation going on with religion? Well, because you can point a lot of things. There was, in 1818, there were a series of very, very strong earthquakes in the New Madrid fault zone of southeast Missouri around the Mississippi River. Forced the Mississippi River to flow backwards for a second, which is pretty amazing. But they were felt all over the country, and it was considered to be, it was exploited. It was nabbed by the snake oil blowhards to say, oh, well, this is a sign. This is a sign of the second coming. And so that was one of the things that got the Second Great Awakening going. Of course, later on, religious fervor would be driven by developments in science, and so as sort of a reaction to challenges of their ideology. So these people in New England who were anti-removal, right? Most of these New Englanders were not Jacksonian Democrats. They were opposed to anything the Jacksonian Democrats did in the 1830s and 1840s. And so they were the chief opponents of Indian removal. People like Samuel Worcester was an example. He was a missionary from Vermont, and wound up, becoming an influential individual within the Cherokee Nation. But there are many, many like him. Well, in New York and New England, we begin to see these missionary societies, and even in time there were groups, actually in the 1880s and 1890s. There was a group in New York who would meet annually at Lake Mohonk, which is one of the one of the lakes in upstate New York. And they would meet at this beautiful, gorgeous hotel, which I think is still there. And they would have a conference. They would call it the Lake Mohonk Conference of the Friends of the Indian, because there was only one Indian, right? The Friends of the Indian is what they called it. So they were like a fraternity of people who had never met Native Americans, but they really liked them, all right? So anyway, these people began to provide some advice and became vocal about United States Indian policy, and so they had an input on this whole reservation era. They did believe that it was the United States' destiny to expand to the Pacific. They believed that what we would call today free market capitalism in a liberal sense, or the original meaning of liberalism in an economic sense, not a political sense, but an economic sense. They believed in that. Some of us still do, but it's hard to get it anymore. So anyway, it's they believed in these different values. They also believed that agriculture, kind of like Jefferson, they believed that agriculture was kind of the answer to assimilation. And why were they so interested in assimilating or acculturating and assimilating? You know the difference, right? Acculturation, you can kind of live with a group. Assimilation is when you kind of blend in with them. They wanted assimilation. Why did they want assimilation? They wanted assimilation because they were good people, and they believed that was the only way Native Americans were ever going to survive. Native American people were going to survive. This is where the term save the Indian, or no, kill the Indian, save the man. You know, you've heard of that. They wanted to get rid of the savagery and the things that they considered unacceptable to American society, and they wanted Native peoples to assimilate so that they would not perish, so that they could enjoy, you know, the virtues of American society. The non-religious really didn't care. You know, the traders and the trappers and people in the far west at this time, you know, they had far closer understanding and intimate relation and cooperation with Native peoples. They didn't have any sense of wanting to change them. But anyway, so and a lot of this has to do, you know, it's kind of funny that the people who are farthest away from Native peoples are the ones who seem to, you know, be their greatest advocates, or at least in their own minds were their greatest advocates. All right. But then we have things like gold rushes and silver rushes, and we have economic booms that attract Americans to places. You could also perhaps say the Homestead Act was basically opening up free farmland for there's free farms for the taking after 1862. But anyway, your textbook author mentions the gold rush and how this extended movement across the plains, and of course initially the plains tribes put up with it, and then they decided not to, and so the federal government got involved. The Transcontinental Railroad, 1869, is connected. That would of course be the beginning of the end for the bison, American bison. This is a story that your textbook author tells that I rarely ever see in a textbook, but it's an important one, and that it has to do with Indian title, really, and what was going on in California in the early 1850s. Think about this. California was originally Spanish territory, right? Then Mexico inherited it. And then the United States took it over after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, after the end of the Anglo-Mexican War. And that was in 1846, right? 1848. So California suddenly becomes United States territory. Nobody was really interested in California, not even the Spanish back in the 1700s. They were really not very good colonists, they weren't very active in California. They had things going on other places, but Mexico just kind of continued on they gave a lot of autonomy to the Californios who lived there in the first half of the 19th century. The United States took over California, and only in a few places recognized the presence of land title by the Californios, and they certainly didn't recognize any title by the Indians. Now, if you know anything about the native peoples of California, and especially of Central and Northern California, that was the focus of the gold rush around Sacramento and San Jose. Well, Sacramento and the northern part of the Central Valley in the Sierras. a lot of the native groups in California were very small groups. They were, they didn't practice agriculture of any kind, unlike most tribes. They subsisted often on things like acorns. So they had, a real specialized, low protein diet. Didn't allow for a lot of, they hunted small game, but they didn't have the cultural capabilities to support large societies. Not even as complex as what you would find in the eastern part of North America. But small groups of people who were not warlike like the Plains tribes. They wouldn't defend themselves like the Plains tribes could. And so here you have the gold rush, right? And it's basically an open season on the land to get gold. Now the gold rush, of course, was a massive influx of population from about 1850 to about 1853 from all over the world. People came in every way they could get there. And placer mining, the type of mining that for gold, that when you pan for gold, that was what most people arrived to do. Very few of them ever struck gold. Very few of them, they gave up really quick. Then the industrial mining came along in the form of both shaft mining and hydraulic mining. But before that all happened, California was kind of on its own. It was a state very early. It really didn't have a territorial period. In fact, it was, supposedly a republic, the Bear Flag Republic for just a little bit. But it was a state very, very early, and that meant that the local population had a lot of control over crime and activity. So the federal government really didn't have much of a presence there. And that was to the detriment of the native peoples of California. You think about the motives now. If there's land with gold in it, all right, and that land hasn't been ceded by Indian tribes, but there are Indian people on the land back there, what's the potential problem? If they own that land, then they also own the resources on the land, and a state can't legally interfere with Indian country, and non-Indians have no business being on that Indian land. But there were not any treaties established early enough before the gold rush to protect or to designate title to those lands. This opened up a very brutal time in California when if you can imagine, okay, there's an ulterior motive here. It's kind of like the Endangered Species Act, right? The Endangered Species Act, right? Yeah. Some people say the Endangered Species Act killed a lot more endangered species than a lot of other things. Okay, because if a landowner finds there's an endangered species of some sort, maybe let's say a rare woodpecker, okay, living on his land, and he has 10,000 acres of forest land, then the federal government's going to put a moratorium on his land use so that it can protect that species. But if they don't ever find the species, you're never going to have any problems from the government. So you have this phenomenon called shoot, shovel, shut up, right? And that's kind of what happened in California. Native peoples were hunted down, literally hunted and shot, because they probably would have had title to that land and would have kept minors out of it.
They
There's-
don't teach us about this in school.
Hmm?
They don't teach us about this in school.
There's a book called Pushed into the Rocks. It's about this. And of course, there's a lot more. That was a book published about 30 years ago. But it's a,
Don't they think that some of the last contacted people on North America?
yeah, Ishi.
California, 'cause they ran into the woods.
Yeah, you've heard of Ishi?
Yeah,
He was,
the 1930s or 40s.
yeah, he and his family apparently had lived like a couple of generations without having any contact. They've avoided contact with whites. And you can read about him. Of course, he was taken in by an anthropologist at the University of California, Berkeley, and he kind of had a sad ending. Anyway. Huh. For some reason, we're locked up. I didn't think computers ever locked up. Well, I guess that means we're done. What is the deal here? Oh, here we go. No, can't leave yet. Can't leave yet. Let me at least cover this. 5 civilized tribes. Oh, we've already talked about the split in the 5 tribes, right? During the Civil War, troops largely left. There were a lot of military forts in the Southern Plains, created primarily to, we could say, protect the 5 tribes who had a lot of political clout, okay, from the Comanches. And the Comanches and the Chickasaws were always getting into skirmishes after.
And the Chickasaw or the Choctaws and
The Chickasaws were farther west. They were closer to the Comanches before the reservations were established. Comanches, and less so probably the Kiowa Apache. But the Comanches would raid the ranches of the Chickasaws in the Arbuckles in that area. So the Chickasaws had a lot of pull, and they were able to get places like Cantonment established. You know, El Reno. You ever been to that place? It was a federal fort, basically, and also the one up near Woodward, Fort Supply, and later Fort Sill. Okay, and there were others, but there was basically a string of United States Army posts along the perimeter of the high plains, where this part of the world, you know, the lowlands meet the high plains, along that boundary, and that's pretty much to create a barrier between the true plains tribes and the civilized tribes. Okay. Anyway, so these militia or these I'm going to give up here. I can't really jump into this. I continue on with this in another lecture, so it's interesting. But this is all added. I didn't include much. I didn't really include. Well, I think he does talk about this in the text. Anyway, we'll talk more about Grant's peace policy next time. I do want you to. We do need to talk about some treaties, like the second Treaty of Fort Laramie. The first one was 1858. The second one was really significant, 1867. And, whoop, that's not right. That's incorrect. These are wrong. I need to fix that. So the second Treaty of Fort Laramie is 1868. The Treaty of Medicine Lodge, 1867. And anyway, we'll look at that next time, I think.